Hello. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much to the IWP for hosting this event. I'm Luis Muñoz, Director of the MFA Spanish Creative Writing Program, and it's my pleasure to introduce Santiago Sanchez, who recently graduated from the Edward Writers Workshop and is currently teaching at Grinnell College.
Hi everyone. Hi. Thank you for being here. So we have Lina here tonight. So I'm going to introduce Lina. She's going to read for about 30 minutes. We're going to have a conversation following that, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. So I'm just going to give a little, introduction to Lina, in case you don't know her. Lina Meruane is an award-winning Chilean author of short stories and 5 novels, including Nervous System and Seeing Red, which was the winner of the prestigious Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Prize and the Premio Valle Inclán. She's also the author of several nonfiction books, including Viral Voyages, Tracing AIDS in Latin America. And she's received grants from the Guggenheim Foundation for the National Endowment for the Arts. And she was also a DAAD writer in residence in Berlin. She currently teaches at NYU, teaching creative writing and global cultures. But as we talked earlier, she's currently in Madrid, which I'm so jealous. So with that being said, I'll just pass the floor over to Lina. She's going to read 2 stories.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here, everybody. Thank you very much, Luis Muñoz, for for everybody for receiving me so warmly here in Iowa. I'm very excited. I've also been at the library. Lisa showed us the Donoso papers, Donoso being one of the most important Chilean writers. So I've had a very beautiful time, and I'm very excited to be reading today. It's a little bit harder for me to read in English just because the rhythm of the readings of the text is a little bit different than Spanish, but I'll do my best. So I'm going to be reading 2 short stories. The first one is very short. It appeared in the White Review, and the second actually just appeared in Freeman's. So they're not so new, but new in English. And both of them are translated by Megan McDowell, who is my translator into English. I'm very lucky to have her as a translator. So this short story is called Deeper. Glasses are very important. So Deeper. She wasn't going to let them close the hole they'd opened in her. They left it there, an islet of flesh probing the depths, a dark seeping navel covered only by a patch of that bordered the long hairs beneath, a stained patch that stuck to those occasional hairs, tugging on them a little, yanking them out when she pulled off the gauze and displayed her perfect hole. The one they had opened in her in the operating room so they could remove the rotten organ. The hole they decided to leave in her, open, contending that the cut had still to exude its pus, drain all the hidden filth that had built up inside her appendix over all those years. Only after that they could close it up. She wasn't going to let them sew her up. That was what she said, definitely, emphatically, without letting her voice shake. That unbreakable no slid through the telephone line from her dilapidated house to the peeling public hospital. Like a thrown stone, it reached the secretary at her desk. Had she not felt strong enough to make it to her appointment to close up the wound? The secretary hit back, refusing the patient's no like a ball, kicking it with fury, that no. And how was it that the patient had already returned to work so soon? She went on, sour-faced, scratching the dry tip of her pen over the form, forcing the ink out. Had she gone to work just like that, with that open hole? The hospital's somber secretary had blurted out that last part, but she corrected herself right away, ashamed, blushing, reprimanded perhaps by an elbow jab from a colleague who heard the vulgarity offered by that secretarial mouth, those reddened lips, chapped, shining with bitter bureaucratic saliva. She corrected herself then. "I mean," she said, "did you go to work with that open wound?" "No," repeated the patient, saying she would never return to the operating room. "Thank you very much, but no." And that monosyllable penetrated the cardiac nerve of the telephone and reached the other side, only to split between the two secretaries who were now lending ears. Seeking to recover control of the conversation, the first secretary pushed the other away, sunk her head down a bit between her shoulders, and in a voice as low as she could go, she told Mirta, that was the name on the file, that they had been waiting for her the day before, all dressed entirely in white, their hands gloved to the elbows, their mouths masked and closed, holding back putrefied jokes about their nurses, the secretary thought disgustedly. And surely there was a joke in there about her, the woman who'd left them waiting with the needle raised, holding a plastic thread that rippled in the artificial breeze of the badly ventilated operating room. "Standing up the doctors is a serious thing, Miss Mirta, but even more so, it's dangerous," she insisted, raising her voice with a certain know-it-all jangle. "So very dangerous for you to be walking around with an open hole. If the hole, or the wound," she corrected herself again, as her co-worker raised her brows and gesticulated. "If the wound had stopped suppurating, then it was necessary to proceed immediately to close it up." The echo of another "no" was heard, tired or perhaps distracted. The bearer of the supplementary hole was curling her lashes with one hand while the other tried to stretch out the tangled phone cord. That "no" summarized things she didn't have time for now. Things like how she still painfully recalled the muck they had excised from her, the bleeding cut, the diagnosis. Things she wasn't saying, the spasms of the first week and the disgust, the nauseating smell that wafted from in there, the vertigo she felt on seeing what she was in that hole the first time she pulled off the gauze. And things she did say, like thank you, because once the moment of filth was past, she had glimpsed in her interior the solution to her problems. "And just what were those problems?" retorted the voice from the other end, those cracked secretarial lips on the phone, those eyes in the intermittent gleam of the screen. "What were all those problems she had?" repeated the secretary, and she cursed through her teeth and the broken nail that had just caught in her stocking. "Put food on the table, fill my belly every night," the secretary heard Mirta say. "Because how long those nights had been," said Mirta. "How blue those nights, how frantic," she said, staring into her own eyes in the mirror, her eyes dark holes. "Because though they had cured her, they had also nearly killed her afterward with hunger. There was no need to feed her." "And so," said Mirta, now curling the other false eyelash with the same little spoon, propping the phone between her head and her bare shoulder, "that's why I'm not going to let you saw me up. I hope I have I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time, because time, she repeated, is money, and don't I know it? And wouldn't Mirta have to know it after she'd spent an entire week in the bed, looking in consternation at the viscous opening, watching how its edges gradually dried out as her ribs raised up, came into view from lack of food. She had grown slacker, more avid, and her jumpy eyes and sharp cheekbones had granted her a strange beauty. The secretary gave a faint bureaucratic smile while she listened to Mirta add that she'd had a premonition that hole, dry at the edges and wet in the depths of her side, would become miraculous. Miraculous, the functionary sighed impatiently, watching as her cubicle mate fled, just as the equally fleeting time was slipping away, and her lunch break along with it. A miracle to multiply ham and cheese sandwiches, she thought greedily, making a starving grimace. A miracle to multiply money, she imagined then, gripped by the sudden certainty that something wasn't right in the file of the woman, Mirta Sepulveda. How was it possible that her marital status was empty, that the space for profession was blank, that there was nothing in the hole left for income? She narrowed her eyes, sure she had found a reparable omission, one she was going to correct. The secretary's silence was followed by another. It was Mirta swallowing her nose and all her intestinal words while she thought about how to explain that miracle. She wasn't crazy, no, and nor was she a religious fanatic. No crying virgin had appeared to her in the nocturnal shadows of her walks or in the oval of the empty plate. She had simply got up from bed in the late night hours, removed the patch hardened by secretions, and examined that new opening, pink and soft. And she'd caressed the edge with a finger and then even stuck it inside, as though smearing it with warm air and fingerprints. That hole was unique. No one was going to take it away. And without washing or putting on perfume or makeup, almost without getting dressed, but in full self-control, she had gone out to the only hole in the wall joint that could be open at those night owl hours. She approached the bars that kept the liquor store owner safe from all the riff-raff of hot-headed drunks and assailants, said Mirta, an expert in the night. From the bars, from its chairs wound 3 times around, she whistled to the owner and asked him to give her a bag of chips and a Coke on credit. The owner recognized her in spite of his short side and her skinny, tousled appearance, and he brought her the chips and the can and asked her where she'd got to. She raised her skirt and showed him her scrawny thighs and pointed pelvis and hairless pubis and her hole. And the store owner unlocked the chain and the bars and invited her to sit down while he stuck his finger in there to see how far it went. He uncorked a premium wine, said Mirta, in such a secret way that more than hearing what she said, the secretary felt it as a vibration in her eardrum, the silky tremor of some syllables that entered and then left, barely grazing the inside of her ear. It was a very good wine, repeated Mirta, adding that the owner had paid her 3 times what he had on any other occasion because she'd let him debut that hole, and he paid her in advance for every one of the following nights. The word spread, and other interested parties appeared. They all wanted to go deeper, said Mirta, in a whisper that became joy in the ear of the secretary, who crossed her leg over her knee and looked discreetly at her own thighs pressed together, the torn stocking, the fingernail that crept up to the run, and the secretary pulled on the tear making the run go a little higher up, a little further in. Thanks. Okay, so I'll tell you more about this story when we get to the Q&A, but I'll just leave it for now hanging. This second story is just a little bit longer, and it's called Her Skin So Lovely. Mom told us not to worry. Everything would be fine without Dad. Such a good person, Mom. And so pretty, now that she didn't cry anymore and she'd gone back to using the lotions that softened her skin. She'd let her hair grow out and the black locks cascaded over her bare shoulders. Don't worry, children. Mother won't leave you. Mother will take care of everything. So confident she was, her step so light since he'd left. And she said, Mom did, that even though things outside were hard, there would always be a sun on the horizon. And it was true. There was the sun shining against an astonishing blue. See, children? Look at it there. And she'd open the curtains and the windows to let the day enter, the breeze that smelled of spring. We would stick our heads out and distract ourselves looking at the cats on neighboring balconies and the birds chirping out their boldness on the railings, and also at the moles that ventured through the streets down there, below. We had fun counting the bees that hummed in the gardens full of flowers. We never got tired of naming all the species we'd learned from school books. At nighttime, we stayed awake, lying in the big bed of Mom without Dad, with Mom and her dark curls who let us cuddle up and caress her lovely skin, her warm skin that smelled of milk. In a cooing voice, she told us of the fish that were reproducing in the oceans now that there were no ships interrupting their love or spilling oil and polluting the water. Her voice told us of the white swans that now inhabited the deserted cities. Have you ever seen such swans, children? The colossal swans in the Venetian canals? She told us of the Thai elephants and their babies blithely crossing the streets, and of the roaming cows, of the lions asleep atop hot highways, of the goats frolicking in now deserted theme parks. She lulled us with pumas leaping the fences around houses and marsupials bathing in pools until the rooster crowed us awake again. How pretty your song, rooster, cried Mom, clapping and laughing like another child among us, making us laugh with her, as if her joy was ticking the hungry children we had become. Mom was another person without Dad in the house. Her skin shone now. There were teeth in her smile. There were lips in her face, pink cheeks and eyes where before there had been only tension. Because Dad had complained about everything, blamed her for everything, punched the table when she served her insipid vegetable dinners, accused her of killing us with hunger, him and her very own kids. Mum whimpered, Dad howled. There was no excuse, not the shortages or the closing of the slaughterhouses and the meat packing factories shuttered because of the infection that was spreading through towns and cities. How could she keep feeding us with lettuce and tubers and soy paste and that whole collection of fetid cheeses full of worms that were left for us in boxes in the welcome mat? He was going to make her pay with her body so she would have a reason to whimper. Mum replied that if this was about paying, she was the one who paid. She was the one who had funds in the bank while he'd been unemployed for months. That money pained Dad. That money made him kick the walls, made him bellow in his threats. One more potato and I'll mash it on your eyes. You heard me? One more carrot and it's up your nose, he muttered through his teeth so we wouldn't hear him from the living room. We heard him clearly through the walls, and we could almost see him burning Mom's pretty face with a boiling yam or suffocating her with lentil puree. He always attacked her about the food, and Mom raised her voice in self-defense, not caring that her shouts pierced into our sides. Mom lowered her voice and finally confronted him. Where did he want her to get that meat he insisted on eating? All that infected meat that was going to get us sick and kill us if he didn't kill us first. And when she saw him silent and diminished, she took the chances to tell him to figure out for himself where to get the funereal hamburgers and the ribs that had turned him into a raving lunatic. What kind of example are you setting for the children? Aren't you such a man? Act like a man then, she told him furiously. And Dad's head sank further into his shoulders and showed us a lamentable bald spot that we would have liked to caress. But we didn't have time to get near Dad. He straightened up without looking at her and left the kitchen. He went into his room and got on his computer in his desperation, and he came out a few hours later to announce that he had bought a gun. A pistol? Mom started to cry, while Dad proclaimed with contempt that his gun would arrive the next day in a wooden box that was very big and very heavy. A rifle? Mom trembled as she clutched the pot she couldn't bring herself to wash. Dad sank into the silence, again in his room, and Mom made space in her bed that night. No one got a wink of sleep because we couldn't fit on the mattress, and because we were anxious to see the dawn arrive with its long box, with its long and shiny rifle that could hold more bullets than we could count. Dad crossed the cartridges over his chest and under his jacket, and he hoisted up that rifle he'd never seen before, much less touched. A rifle he didn't know how to fire, and he went out and slammed the door behind him. Mom locked herself in the bathroom and vomited, imagining all the blood and all the meat she was going to have to cook for us and eat with us, eat in front of us, with her eyes wide open over the plate, Dad's rifle pointed at her head. Mom let him go without even a see you soon or take care. She bolted the door and stood listening to his footsteps on the stairs. From the window, we watched him appear on the street. He paused on the corner and turned around to wave, but he tripped over the ducks that had installed themselves behind him. There was a flurry of squawks and insults, and Dad kicked 2 or 3 with his boots while we secretly begged him to grab a duck by the neck and throw it to us as a consolation prize we would eat that night, even if we had to pluck it and stick it into the pot ourselves, without any help from Mom. But Dad didn't waste time on the ducks. Dad had equipped himself for larger game, and he was already getting further away from us. We saw him shrink in the distance and disappear among other men with long guns who were loaded down with munitions. Men like him, without children, without women, without anything to lose. "Mom!" we shrieked as soon as we realized that Dad was unprotected. "Mom! Mom!" terrified, seeing the mask dangling from the doorknob. We ran to find her in the kitchen refuge to tell her Dad had gone out without his face cover. "He could get sick," we said. "Yes, children, he would die." Mom murmured with a grimace of disgust frozen on her face as she stirred a pot of rice with water and a little sugar, no cinnamon sticks. Mom told us not to worry, to stop looking out at the street, But when she saw us wandering around aimlessly, she gave us permission to spend our days looking out for Dad's return. We kept watch from the heights of our open window, then our closed window, then open, then closed, closed because the air was starting to grow cooler. Mom saw us stationed there, and then she was the one who wandered around us. She'd come up behind us, whisper into the napes of our necks that a watched pot never boils, and that Dad would come back one of these days when we least expected it. That Dad would get sick and the poor wolves wouldn't eat him. That Dad wouldn't get sick and the poor wolves wouldn't eat him. Wolves? We hadn't even thought about wild wolves. But she had. She'd imagined the wolves skinning Dad. She'd wished for them to tear him apart. We detected it in the murky depths of her voice. Mom was afraid we would see him coming from the distance, that among all the armed men in the street, one would turn out to be Dad. But the pot was boiling on the stove, and Mom cooked the vegetables that arrived ever more sporadically, and the days passed, and the wind picked up and spilled leaves from the trees by the hundreds, piles of leaves turning yellow before they rotted on the pavement with no one to sweep them. Dried leaves that the rain dragged off toward the gutters. And the snow began to cover the streets no one cleared. The rusted cars emptied of the gas that used to start them up. Across the snow, we'd say to ourselves, Dad would come walking with a deer on his shoulders, or at least one of those skunks that smelled so bad, but had such tender flesh. So lovely, their fur. Mom was untangling her shiny black hair with her thin fingers while she looked at us from the kitchen and begged us to sit down to eat her noodles with oil and the last dried out tomatoes. Losing her patience, she warned us that very soon violent hail would start to fall. The windows would be smashed. What do you want, children? You want to let shards of glass rain down on you so your skin can get infected now that there is no more medicine? Lose your eyes, is that what you want? No, we didn't want to lose anything, not our tongues or a hand, and much less an eye. We'd already lost pounds, molars, hair. We had lost Dad, but not our hunger. We closed the blinds and the curtains, suspecting that Dad had forgotten about us, that Dad had hunted and killed deer and bears, and he'd eaten them on his own or in the company of other men armed to the teeth. We swallowed Mom's insipid noodles, thinking that perhaps the one who'd been hunted down was him, because outside any slip-up could be deadly. That was the place of flesh, one's own. We didn't get sad thinking about it, nor were we happy. We didn't feel anything for Dad anymore. Just a calculation in the bones of our raised ribs of the days that had passed. If we didn't go out, it was because we remembered what we'd learned before the school was shut down. What we had been taught by the teacher, so robust she'd been, with hands so thick, the food chain. That teacher Mom had scorned for being fat had told us it was the law of nature to eat other animals, and that they, large or small, would eat us before or after. She didn't tell us when the time would be right, but she insisted that someday our flesh would be feasted on by the worm species, and that eventually we'd become part of the bushes and the fruit trees that fed other animals. Someday we would be zebras or giraffes running through the parks. Mom liked that part of the lesson. She always applauded at that point, asked us to tell her that story again, and we would repeat it, changing some parts. The night when we were going to be camels, Mom smiled, her face a little fallen and hollow-eyed, but still beautiful, and she replied, "Someday, children, when we can go out, we'll go to the zoo and we'll find a caged macaque there, furiously shaking the bars, a macaque with green eyes just like your father." Mom didn't mention him again, and maybe it was better, for the best. Mom didn't mention him again, and maybe it was better, for the best, that Dad didn't come back. Vegetables were growing scarcer, and there was no longer any way to get flour, yeast, milk, rice, and the fewer the mouths, the more there was for each of us. Plus, Dad ate for a whole army. Mom opened the cupboards as if they were nocturnal windows emptied of stars. She closed the cupboards and soothed out hungry sleeplessness by telling us how giant and nearly extinct tortoises had begun to spawn again in the hot sand by the sea. Fearless now, with no egg hunters around, no tourists or overbearing bathers who were all the same thing. Men. Men? Enormous edible eggs stolen by hungry men. What did Mom mean? Weren't we men, too? "Not you," replied Mom. "You are only children." But we were men, small men, though not so small as we'd once been. And if we didn't die first, we would turn into grown men whom Mom detested. Mom listened to the radio and repeated to us what she learned from it, that life on Earth was composed of infinite plants and germs, of finite species, and very minimally by men who had taken it upon themselves to end everything. "That cannot be," she said. "That's why the end of men's coming. My sweet boys, the revenge of the species is coming." "Mom," we said, staring at her, her skin so taut and smeared with oil, the weave of her muscles over her bones, her veins lit up. "Mom," we repeated, infuriated with her, "the men have already started to die. They're being devoured by wolf packs and birds of prey and worms. There are men rotting in the streets under clouds of flies." "It's about time," Mom murmured with jumpy eyes, crushing a breadcrumb with a finger and depositing it on her tongue. "Mom," we insisted, knowing it was useless. "They're in the streets looking for food, and they collapse on the sidewalks, those men who aren't even men anymore." Mom pretended not to hear what we were saying, twirled her grieving hair around a finger while we thought about all those cadavers stuck in freezers, all that meat in the now empty meat packing factories that were functioning as morgues. Meat that would be lost when the electricity went out. So much wasted meat. We said nothing, but our desperation must have shone through, because Mom got up from the table, went to the door and locked it with the only key in the house, and the key remained in the fist that Mom hid behind her back. Mom looked at us with feverish eyes, told us not to dare come near her. We were no match for her, even though she knew that, skinny as she was, we could easily lift her up. We could force her arm, take away the key. We would open the door, go down the stairs, and disappear down the foggy neighborhood streets. "Mom," we said, advancing slowly toward her. "Mom, be good. Give us the key. Stand aside. Let us out." We almost couldn't talk to her without salivating. We almost couldn't look at her in her torn nightgown, her arms bare, the stiff hairs of her underarm sticking out around the edges. It was better not to see her like that, while she told us that we weren't her children anymore, but dirty, bloody men, carnivorous like Dad. But, she said haughtily, she wasn't going to allow us to go out that door. She opened her mouth and swallowed the key as if it were made of air, showed us her empty tongue, her juicy tongue. She pressed her lips together, and then she smiled at us, baring her gums. And we smiled, too, astonished by what she had just done, admiring her quickness and cunning, adoring her determination and beauty, realizing that there was only one way we were leaving that house, and it was by eating Mom. Thank you.
Lina, how should we do the...
However you want. I can stay here if you want, and I don't know, or you can stand up, or we can both sit. This is your decision.
This is working, yeah? You can all hear me? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was incredible. Darkness, the comedy. I loved your responses, Garth. So, can you tell us a little bit about these stories, the process of writing them, where the idea, the energy, the texture you were reaching for?
Yeah, sure. So the first story, Deeper, actually came from a story that was told to me by a psychiatrist who worked at a hospital, and there was a woman who came and refused to have her wound closed after her, I don't know how you say this, appendectomy. Anyway, so he was sent. He actually worked. This friend of mine. He worked with drug addicts actually, but he knew Spanish because he was Colombian, and so he was sent to try to understand why she didn't want her hole closed, and to try to convince her to get it closed because it was dangerous for her to have that opening. So he told this at a dinner, and I thought that the story was actually that she was a prostitute and she was using that other hole as a sort of an extra amenity. So he told the story, of course, briefly, and as things that really shock you, it stayed in my mind, and it turned into the story of the conversation between the secretary at the hospital and herself, and sort of all the other extras are things that I put into that story. I was really fascinated, and I'd say also that I always write about something that sort of moves me and I can't forget. So some story that is just sort of stays with me, because it's not only about sort of the weirdness of what that decision is, it's also about precarity and vulnerability, and also taking sort of charge of your own body and what you are going to be using it for. So it crossed a few things that I am personally interested, all these sort of different themes about female bodies and who is going to decide for those bodies, and how the medical institution works in deciding over those bodies and at the same time caring for them. So there is a sort of a very ambiguous place there. I remain undecided on what I think about this situation and what should have been done. But it crosses the question of poverty and something that is sort of thrown in there, which is, yes, they were supposed to cure me, but I was unfed, and so I couldn't feed myself, and I was going to starve to death. So sort of all those contradictions I found super interesting, and again, are connected to things that I mind about very much. So that's how I wrote that story. And the second story, which is more contemporary, is a story that I was asked to write a story about apocalypse. And as usual, it took me like 6 months to write the story because I was doing other things. And then the pandemic started. And so I didn't have an idea, actually, when I started writing this short story. What I had was the image of all these animals sort of taking back the city. And I was very fascinated by that event. I'm sure everybody was. I didn't really know how to put it into a story. But then, magically, as it sometimes happens, the mom appeared and the children appeared and the hunger appeared and the situation with the father. I was saying the other night for people who were there that I put together a number of stories that have to do with hunger and need. And this actually was a story that again brought me to the question of hunger. I'm not very sure why I'm obsessed with hunger. I'm not a very hungry person myself, but yeah, I think there's something about sort of being fed and caring, and not being able to feed, and all sorts of things that came up. And I didn't think it was going to be a funny story, but then I realized that sometimes when you read and you get into it, it can actually have a sort of a weird twist. And I was actually quite entertained by the way in which the story went into this weird direction. At one point, I thought that the story would end up with the children actually eating the mother, and then I thought, no, that's too much. I think I could end it here and just leave it there.
Oh, let me see. Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
I love hearing you say the word whole so many times.
I actually took one of those out. Because I kind of edited a little bit just because there's some parts in parentheses that are just really hard to follow the story if I put them in. But there's a whole with W. There's the translator actually really sort of played with, but I thought I can't do that. I mean, it's hard for me to read in English. And so I took some little parts out that just made it too complicated for me to find sort of the rhythm. But so one whole was out.
One whole is out, okay. I missed that one. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about, I felt like there was something happening in the language there from like wound to whole, and how the secretary like corrects herself, like the transformation of that, of a wound becoming a hole that's used for something else.
Yeah.
And I was trying to see if there was a transformation like that in the apocalypse story. Do you feel like there is a certain transformation of something desperate or a lack or a loss that like becomes something else?
I'm not sure I understand the second part of the question.
So I'm interested how like this thing that's like a wound becomes like a thing for pleasure or a thing for money.
Oh.
So that reversal of like what we anticipate to be something negative, becoming something maybe positive.
So the transformation in meaning of the words.
Yeah, and if that happens in some way in the second story.
That's a difficult question. So I want to say that in Spanish, when we say whole, I don't know in English, but in Spanish, hoyo is like a very vulgar word, at least in Chilean Spanish, because not all Spanishes are the same and not all the words have the same charge. So I was interested in sort of how those two words related. They're the same thing, and like descriptively, in the case of this woman, they're the same thing. But actually the connotation between wound, which is a almost medicalized word, right? It's sort of connected to pathology and cure. In whole actually sort of is a very vulgar sexual word. And I'm kind of interested in the question you asked, because they actually are the same place and the same sort of object in that body, but they have quite different connotations. And it's interesting how I think for me, the secretary captures the sort of the dirt, and also is prejudiced with this woman. She's suspicious, right? So she kind of knows before knowing, and she's actually going into the sort of insisting on this word as if she was trying to force her to speak clearly about what she's doing with her body, right? And it's sort of in that place of more moral kind of judgment that the secretary is bringing about. I think for Mirta, actually, whole is a good word because it's the word that's feeding her. It's the thing that's feeding her. So she's not interested in having a wound, right? And she actually, in the end, doesn't have a wound anymore. She just has an opening, right? So she's sort of rejecting the medicalization of her body, and she's resisting. And I like that about this character, that she resists sort of the medical world. I've written a lot about medicine, as I think you know, and sort of I see the point in going to the doctor, of course, but also sort of sometimes it's necessary to resist some impositions and decide for your own body. So that's something that I like about Mirta. Now in the other story, and this is a little bit harder to answer, like how do meanings reverse or, I'm not sure. That's a good question for a critic. I haven't thought about it.
Can I ask you, so the mother, I feel like she's also like resisting in a way, like she's very staunchly saying like, we're just gonna start here, like you guys can't go out, we're just gonna stay here. And how there's a bit of a, I don't know, there's something about that resistance that felt like parallel. And maybe that she was making that choice to stay there?
Yeah, and actually when you were speaking, I was actually thinking of something a little different, which is sort of the transformation that occurs in the story is that the children grow, right? And so they become men, and the mother is very anti-men because she's had a difficult husband, to say the least. So it's the children having to decide whether they will go with the mother or turn into the father. And I think that is something that I was interested in. It's something that I've also worked on, but with girls turning into women. And here it's like this sort of violent masculinity that is playing out in the children, but it's actually sort of connected to the need of food and meat, right? The sort of the sense of being a carnivore as being like violent, right? But at the same time, yes and no, because there's like more layers to that. Yeah. I'm not answering so well the question, but I'm trying.
I think everything you're saying is so fascinating. Let me see. Okay, we are at an hour.
We are?
So can we?
5 minutes.
So I'll ask like another question, and we can open up. Well, I'm really curious because you mentioned during dinner that like this whole your medical obsession, you think that you might be done with it. So like your two previous books were like very medically focused.
Yes.
They're both about illness. These two stories are like there's hunger in both of them. So like there's this interest in the body and how it expresses itself through illness or hunger. Like, where do you feel like you exhausted that obsession or
well,
yeah,
exhausting obsessions. That's just a really hard one.
Or are you turning your back on it? Is it too much to just like?
No, I think how I feel about this is that the body has been my long-lasting obsession politically. Aesthetically, right? How the body, how it transforms, but also how the body is always a target of politics. So those things, it's just like everything seems to bring me back to the body, and I just can't avoid that. I think that what I'm a little sick of is disease. Yeah. So I think I need to move away from that, and I'm actually have a very different writing project. I'm also like I have worked a lot on female protagonists, and I think I also want to move a little bit away from that now, just to explore different avenues and sensibilities and subjectivities. But yes, I think that's something about disease, and it's sort of like it culminated with a pandemic.
Yeah.
Where I was asked to write a few texts about the theme, and I'm just like I feel that I don't have more questions about that specific element, and I think that when I don't have like a question, I mean, it can come back, of course, but I think I exploited or not answered, but I sort of went into trying to figure out what the answers to my questions are, or how the characters actually deal with my questions, how they solve or not that problem. And I think I have, exhausted that theme, and I don't have further questions, but they could come back, I guess. I don't know. I hope not, but we'll see.
Obsessions come back.
Yeah, I know. You think you can leave them, but they all are always back to you, I guess. Yeah, but there's a number of things I'm interested in, so I think I can rest a little bit from that obsession and give space to other obsessions that are also there. Yeah.
I think we should take some questions. Garth.
Yeah, Garth, please.
So I don't know if this is like a philosophical question or a craft question or both, but thinking about negatives and negativity having a kind of positive force. Like listening to both stories, I kept thinking about Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener in the sense building a story around a central act of saying no, a central act of refusal, which in some way seems to be anti-narrative, you know, like insisting on the status quo, resisting action, resisting change or resolution. And I wonder if you could just talk about building a story out of refusal, negation, saying no.
That's a great question. Well, the thing is, saying no, I mean, no is not emptiness. It's not no action. Actually, you brought up this amazing question of refusal, Bartleby, which is very enigmatic, right? And leads to Bartleby's death, right? So there is a sort of inaction that actually has many effects, right? So it seems like this saying no and resisting, I mean, it's like when we flow with whatever is expected from us, there's almost less action than when you say no. Resistance for me is actually even more active than just sort of following the trend, which is what everybody is doing. So staying back, refusing, saying no, resisting, manifesting, or sort of passively aggressively saying no, I think are super strong positions that seem to shake the surroundings of that character, which is, I think, what's happening with Mirta. I hadn't made that connection, but it's actually super, super interesting connection. So I think that it's a very powerful sort of strategy. Also very political in a way. I mean, not necessarily in that story, although it is, because she's resisting an institution, a medicalized institution, and the messengers of the institution who are the secretaries, right? And we know that sort of comandos intermedios, how do you say, like middle people can be even worse than, you know, the people who are in actual power, because they have to prove themselves to power and, you know, force the situation. So that kind of tension, I think, is very productive for writing. And I'm really also interested in the sort of the ways in which sometimes power, this is very Foucauldian, but power is sort of diffused, right, in many different layers. And the middle people, right, become actually the ones who struggle with the one who refuses, because it's on them if the person actually gets their way. So I was interested in that sort of connection between these two women. I'm also interested in, and I was talking to Sabina today about this, the fact that women are not, like there's a misunderstanding I find sometimes with feminism. It's like all women have to be good in your stories, otherwise you're not being feminist enough or something like that. And I consider myself a very, you know, committed feminist, but I have never idealized the figure of women. So the tension between women is also something that I'm interested in, and the sort of the position of this mother who refuses to give the key, and then what is going to happen to her. These sort of gray figures or violent figures that are also women, I'm particularly interested in examining how that happens. So, yeah. Thank you.
Do you have time for another question? Yeah? Doctor?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for reading. I was, having a lot of reactivity to what you were sharing, and I think something about the first story that was really powerful for me was, if I understand it correctly, or I don't want to say that because that's pretty binary, but my experience of the story's transformation was such that Nita's explanation of how she's using this wound, turned, pleasure hole for her own sort of sustainability and viability, then becomes a sort of a point of desire or a point of imagination for this receptionist. Like, I feel like I was understanding it like she was starting to imagine herself with the whole that could then be, that could then, gain her a type of eminence or capital. And I just thought that that was a really powerful, it was almost as if like the stories sort of, like they're like perfume, or like it's like a scent, how it kind of transforms over time, and just was really struck by how, I would have one set of affects or feelings about a particular character or characters, and then those things would, switch, and then I would find myself in this place later that was just, in a completely different space. It's not so much a question, just more of a comment.
No, but that was a super fascinating read, actually, because the story actually ends with a secretary who has sort of run the hole in her stocking, and she's sort of somehow recognizing the freedom in Mirta, and sort of being perhaps kind of turned on, or something about sort of the liberty of her taking control of her own body. And I actually hadn't thought so much about that, but it's true that there is this sort of this thing that happens. It's kind of interesting that, I mean, you are all writers. When you write, sometimes you don't even control exactly what you are doing with your characters, because the characters somehow are doing their own thing, and it just happens in the story, and then you don't give it a second thought. But what you have just said is brilliant, because it's true that there is a moment where Mirta wins, because she sort of makes the secretary or the receptionist feel what she is kind of feeling, sort of this, the strength of her body, her power, right? She's made her body her own, and she's made it work for her own needs and pleasures.
And if I could just comment on that, like to your point about negation, the way that negation or no-ness like opens up this sort of self-reflectivity, or this like it becomes more a type of consciousness is awoken to negation, and then elicits a type of change.
Yeah.
And having that is so transformational. That has to be the word. But.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Shall we call it a night? All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.